He had a ring tan. That was the first thing I noticed, the first real detail I could latch onto from my perch at the kitchen window. A pale, naked band of skin on his left hand, a ghostly imprint of a promise that was no longer there. It was more intimate than seeing him shirtless, which he often was, hauling boxes from the moving truck into the house next door. The house that used to be the Millers, a place of loud summer barbecues and louder marital disputes. Now it was his house. Just his. The tan line was a story, a silent one-act play performed on his hand every time he lifted a box or wiped sweat from his brow. It spoke of absence. I understood absence. My life was a grand cathedral built in its honor. For 3 weeks, I watched him. It wasn't a creepy, hidden-in-the-bushes kind of watching. It was a domestic, over-the-sink, pretending to wash the same plate for 10 minutes kind of watching. I learned the rhythm of his solitude. He left for work at 7 in the morning, his truck a low rumble that vibrated through my floorboards. He came home around 6, the truck doors slamming with a weary finality. Sometimes he'd work in the yard, tearing out the overgrown rose bushes his predecessor, Mrs. Miller, had cherished. He attacked them with a grim determination, the snip of the shears sharp and angry in the quiet evening air. He was erasing a life that wasn't his, and I wondered if he was trying to erase the one that was. His name was Mason, according to the stray piece of mail that ended up in my box. Mason Cole. It was a solid name. A name that felt like it belonged to a man who could fix a leaning fence post or change a tire without consulting a YouTube video. He looked the part. Broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his t-shirts, arms corded with muscle from a life of labor I couldn't begin to imagine, and a face that was stoic to the point of being a mask. He never smiled. Not once in 3 weeks. His expression was a flat line of tired resolve. We hadn't spoken. We'd exchanged the obligatory neighborly nod, a slight dip of the chin that acknowledged shared territory without inviting conversation. I was fine with that. More than fine. Conversation required effort, a performance of normalcy I had little energy for. My job as a graphic designer was remote, my friendships were digital, and my groceries were delivered. My world was a carefully curated bubble of quiet, and Mason, with his loud truck and violent gardening, was a stone thrown against its fragile surface. A stone I couldn't stop watching. The air that afternoon was thick and yellow, the kind of pregnant, heavy stillness that comes before a summer thunderstorm. The birds had gone silent. The leaves on the maple tree between our houses hung limp and expectant. I was at my desk, trying to focus on a logo for a new brand of organic dog food, but my attention kept snagging on the view from my window. Mason was outside, wrestling with a stubborn stump near the property line. His shirt was off, pasted to the back of his jeans by a sheen of sweat. The muscles in his back coiled and released, a beautiful, functional anatomy lesson. And every time his left hand came into view, I saw it. The pale ghost on his finger. Then the sky broke. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a sudden, violent deluge. The wind hit like a fist, whipping the trees into a frenzy. The first crack of thunder was so close, so visceral, it shook my house to its foundations. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging my small office into a gloomy twilight. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of my computer, the background noise of my life, all gone. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the roar of the rain and the howl of the wind. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Mason was jogging toward his back door, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. He disappeared inside, and a moment later, his house, which had been a warm yellow beacon against the storm, also went dark. We were officially in this together. 2 solitary men on a suburban street, islanded by the storm, each alone in his own darkness. My stomach twisted with a strange, unfamiliar flutter. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to anticipation. The storm raged for an hour, a biblical tantrum of light and sound. I sat on my sofa, watching the lightning illuminate the room in stark, momentary flashes. In those brief seconds of clarity, my familiar living room looked alien and strange. The shadows were deeper, the corners more menacing. I felt the isolation I normally cultivated so carefully begin to feel less like a comfort and more like a cage. The silence inside my house was deafening now that the storm was starting to recede, replaced by the steady drumming of rain. I wondered what he was doing. Mason. Was he sitting in the dark, too? Was he used to this kind of silence? Or did it echo with the ghosts of voices that used to fill it? The ring tan suggested a partner, a wife. A life of shared spaces and easy conversation. His current life, the one I observed from my window, was monastic by comparison. Maybe this sudden, imposed quiet was a relief for him. Or maybe it was a torment. My own loneliness was a familiar companion, a dull ache I had learned to live with. It was the price of admission for a life free of complication, free of the risk of being known and found wanting. I had my work, my books, my meticulously ordered routines. It was enough. I told myself it was enough so often that I sometimes even believed it. But sitting there in the suffocating dark, the lie felt thin and worn. The rain softened to a drizzle. The sky outside was the color of a bruise. I decided I needed candles, and maybe a check of the circuit breaker, just in case. I fumbled through my junk drawer, my fingers brushing against old batteries and rubber bands until they found the waxy smoothness of a pack of emergency candles. As I was lighting the first one, its small flame pushing back the gloom, I heard a sound. A knock. Soft but firm. On my back door. My heart leaped into my throat. No one ever knocked on my back door. It led to my small, neglected patio, which faced his small, aggressively gardened patio. There was only one person it could be. I froze, the matchstick burning down toward my fingers. My first instinct was to stay quiet, to pretend I wasn't home, to retreat back into the safety of my bubble. But the knock came again, a little louder this time. A polite, patient summons. I took a breath, blew out the match, and walked to the door. I could see his silhouette through the frosted glass, a broad, solid shape against the gray evening. I unlocked the deadbolt, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet house, and pulled the door open. He stood on my patio, rain dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. He was wearing a dark gray t-shirt now, damp and clinging in a way that left little to the imagination. He smelled of rain and wet earth and something else, something uniquely him, a faint, clean scent like sawdust and soap. Up close, his face was even more severe, etched with lines of exhaustion I hadn't been able to see from my window. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, met mine directly. There was no artifice in his gaze. It was steady, patient, and unreadable. "Hey," he said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than I'd imagined. It seemed to settle in my chest, a pleasant, grounding vibration. "Hi." I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Power's out on the whole block," he stated, not asked. He gestured vaguely down the street with his head. "Looks like a transformer blue." "Oh, okay." I was a master of scintillating conversation. I mentally kicked myself. He shifted his weight, and for the first time, I noticed what he was holding. A six-pack of beer, beaded with condensation, and a large, heavy-duty flashlight. He held them out slightly, an offering. "Figured we might be in for a long night. Thought you might want a beer. And I've got a generator, but it's a pain to start. Just wanted to make sure you were okay over here first." The simple, neighborly concern of it disarmed me completely. All my carefully constructed scenarios of what our first conversation would be like, an argument over the property line, a complaint about my overgrown lawn, vanished. He was just a man, checking on his neighbor. A man with tired eyes and a ghost on his finger. "I'm fine," I said, maybe a little too quickly. "Thanks. That's really nice of you." "No problem," he said. He looked past me into the gloom of my kitchen. "Got candles. Just lit one." He nodded, a slow, considering motion. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled only by the dripping of water from my eaves. I should have just said thank you and closed the door. That would have been the safe thing to do, the thing that kept my world intact. Instead, I heard myself say, "Do you want to come in?" I mean, out of the rain, a flicker of something, surprise, relief, passed through his eyes before the mask of stoicism settled back into place. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." He stepped inside, and my small kitchen, my entire house, seemed to shrink around his presence. He filled the space, not just physically, but with an energy, a weight, that I wasn't used to. He set the beer and the flashlight on my counter. The flashlight was a beast, the kind of thing you'd use to signal ships at sea. Compared to my decorative emergency candles, it was a testament to his practicality. "I'm Mason," he said, turning to face me. He offered his hand. It was large and calloused, the knuckles scraped. And there it was, up close. The ring tan. A pale, vulnerable strip of skin in the middle of a battle-hardened hand. Leo, I said, taking his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and brief. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that I felt all the way to my toes. He let go, and my hand felt strangely empty. Leo, he repeated, testing the name. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Right. We stood there for a moment, two strangers in the flickering candlelight. The situation was absurd. An hour ago, he was a character in the story I watched from my window. Now he was in my kitchen, smelling of the storm, his presence a solid, undeniable fact. The stone had not just been thrown against my bubble, it had shattered it completely. And a terrifying, exhilarating part of me was glad. He cracked open 2 beers, the hiss of the cans startlingly loud, and handed one to me. Our fingers brushed. Another small, insignificant touch that felt like a brand. I took a long drink, the cold, bitter liquid a welcome shock to my system. Mason leaned against the counter, mirroring me, and took a sip from his own can. He surveyed my kitchen in the dim light, his gaze lingering on the neat stack of books on my counter, the single coffee mug in the drying rack. He was observing me, just as I had been observing him. I felt suddenly exposed, my quiet, solitary life laid bare for his inspection. You work from home? He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp. Yeah, graphic design, I answered, feeling the need to fill the silence. You? Construction, he said. Framing, mostly. It made sense. The muscles, the calloused hands, the air of quiet capability. He built things. He put skeletons together, gave them structure and strength. I, on the other hand, spent my days moving pixels around a screen, creating illusions of substance. That's got to be hard work, I said, cringing internally at the lameness of the statement. He just shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders. It's honest work. There was no judgment in his tone, just a statement of fact. But I felt a chasm open up between us, the man who worked with his hands and the man who worked with his mouse. We drank in silence for a while. It wasn't as awkward as it should have been. The candlelight softened the edges of the room, creating a small, intimate space around us. The steady drumming of the rain on the roof was a soothing percussion. Mason seemed completely at ease, as if sitting in a near stranger's darkened kitchen was a perfectly normal way to spend an evening. I, however, was a tangled knot of nerves. My mind was racing, analyzing every detail. The way he held his beer can, his thumb absently tracing the rim. The way the candlelight carved shadows under his cheekbones. The faint, persistent scent of him that was slowly filling my kitchen. So, he said, breaking the quiet. How long you lived here? 5 years. You like it? The neighborhood? It's quiet, I said, and immediately felt foolish. Of course it was quiet. My life was a monument to quiet. He gave a short, humorless puff of air that might have been a laugh. It is that he took another long swallow of beer, his throat working. He seemed to be wrestling with something, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he looked at me, his blue eyes intense in the wavering light. The Millers. They were loud, weren't they? The question was direct, disarming. I didn't know how to answer. Admitting I'd listened to their arguments felt like a violation of some unspoken neighborly code. I keep to myself, mostly, I hedged. He nodded, accepting the non-answer. Yeah, I get that. He looked down at his beer can, turning it in his hands. The pale band on his finger seemed to glow in the candlelight. She hated the quiet. Said it felt like being buried alive. The words were dropped into the space between us, heavy and cold. He was talking about his wife, the ghost who haunted the ring tan. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry felt hollow and intrusive. So I said nothing. I just stood there, holding my beer, and listened to the silence he had just filled with his past. He didn't seem to expect a response. Maybe he just needed to say it out loud, to give the ghost a name in a place where it had no history. He pushed himself off the counter. I should get that generator going. It's going to get dark for real soon. He picked up the massive flashlight. You need anything? Batteries? More light. I'm good, I said. Thank you, though. For the beer. And for checking on me. It's what neighbors do, right? He gave me a look that I couldn't decipher. It wasn't a smile, not really, but the grim line of his mouth had softened. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. My grill works. If you get hungry later. And then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click. leaving me alone again in the candlelight. But the room felt different now. It was filled with the echo of his presence, the scent of him, the memory of his low voice. The silence he left behind was heavier, more profound, than the silence he had found. I leaned back against the counter, my heart thumping a strange, unsteady rhythm. The neat, orderly world I had built for myself was beginning to come apart at the seams. I spent the next hour in a state of suspended animation, just sitting at my kitchen table, watching the candle flame dance. I replayed our short conversation over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every glance, every gesture. His offer to share his grill. Was it just a polite, neighborly thing to say? Or was it an invitation? The thought of spending more time with him, of willingly stepping further out of my comfort zone, was both terrifying and deeply alluring. The hunger came eventually, a dull, insistent ache in my stomach. My refrigerator was useless, a cold, dark box. I had some crackers and a can of tuna, the standard provisions of a man who viewed eating as a necessary chore rather than a pleasure. It was a bleak prospect. Then I thought of Mason's offer. A grill. The possibility of a hot meal. More than that, the possibility of not being alone. It was a stupid idea. I should just eat my tuna and retreat into the safety of my own space. But the memory of his steady gaze, the unexpected kindness in his gesture, pulled at me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of desire to connect, to breach the walls I had so carefully constructed. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a package of frozen hamburger patties from my dead freezer and a flashlight from my drawer. My own flashlight was a flimsy plastic thing, a toy compared to his industrial-grade lantern. Armed with my meager offering, I stepped out into the damp, dark evening. The world outside was pitch black, the usual suburban glow completely extinguished. The sky was a canopy of stars, more brilliant and numerous than I had ever seen them from my backyard. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. From Mason's yard, I could hear a low, steady hum. The generator. A small pool of light spilled from his back door, which was propped open. I walked across the wet grass that separated our properties, the ground soft under my feet. It felt like a significant journey, a crossing of a border I had never dared to approach before. As I got closer, I could smell the tantalizing scent of charcoal and grilling meat. He had already started. He was standing on his patio, a dark silhouette against the light from his kitchen. He was hunched over a small kettle grill, tongs in hand. He looked up as I approached, his face illuminated from below by the orange glow of the coals. "Figured you'd get hungry," he said. His voice was calm, unsurprised, as if he had been expecting me all along. "I brought these," I said, holding up the package of hamburgers like a trophy. They were going to go bad anyway. Good thinking. He took them from me, his fingers brushing mine. That now familiar jolt shot through me. He opened the package and laid the patties on the grill next to a couple of hot dogs. They sizzled instantly, releasing a cloud of fragrant smoke. "Grab a seat," he said, gesturing with his head toward a pair of weathered Adirondack chairs on his patio. I sat down, feeling strangely formal and out of place. This was his space. It was neater than I would have expected. The patio was swept clean, his tools were hung in an orderly line on the wall of his garage, and the lawn was meticulously edged. It was the yard of a man who found solace in order, in controlling the small patch of the world that belonged to him. I understood that impulse all too well. He handed me another beer, which he'd apparently kept cold in a cooler by the door, and went back to tending the grill. We didn't talk. We just sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the sizzle of the food and the distant hum of the generator. The light from his kitchen cast long shadows across the yard, and the stars overhead seemed close enough to touch. It was peaceful. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so at peace. My eyes drifted around his yard, taking in the details I couldn't see from my window. The half-finished woodworking project on a sawhorse. The neat stack of firewood against the side of the house. And the gaping hole where the rose bushes used to be, now a patch of raw, turned earth. A wound in the landscape. "I hate roses," he said suddenly, without turning around. He must have seen where I was looking. "They're needy. All thorns and no substance. My mother loved them." I found myself saying, the words coming out unbidden. She had a whole garden of them. He flipped the burgers, the coals flaring up. "My? She did too." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Planted them the week we moved in. Said it made the place feel like home. He paused, his shoulders tense. Guess it didn't work. The vulnerability in that statement was staggering. It was a crack in his stoic facade, a glimpse of the raw pain he was living with. He was a man whose home had been unmade, and now he was tearing out the roses, trying to reclaim the very soil beneath his feet. Food's ready, he announced, his voice gruff again, the moment of softness gone as quickly as it had appeared. He piled the burgers and hot dogs onto a plate and brought them over, along with a bottle of ketchup and a stack of paper towels. We ate with our hands, like children at a picnic. The burger was charred on the outside, juicy on the inside, and it was hands down the best thing I had tasted in years. Maybe because I was actually hungry, or maybe because it was a meal shared. This is good, I said, my mouth full. Thank you. It's just a burger, Leo. No, I mean. For this. For not letting me just sit over there and eat tuna out of a can. He stopped chewing and looked at me. His eyes were serious in the dim light. No one should have to eat tuna out of a can in the dark, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile I had ever seen from him. It transformed his face, easing the hard lines around his eyes and mouth. It made him look younger, less burdened. I felt my own lips curve in response. A real, unforced smile. We were just two men, sitting in the dark, eating burnt hamburgers. And it felt right. After we finished eating, we just sat there, nursing our beers, watching the stars. The initial awkwardness had completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet sense of companionship. I found myself relaxing in his presence, the constant hum of anxiety in my brain dialing down a few notches. With him, I didn't feel the need to perform. I could just be. You're quiet, he observed, his voice a low murmur in the dark. Sorry, I said reflexively. Don't be sorry, he said quickly. It's not a bad thing. It's just. Quiet, he paused. I'm not used to it. The quiet, there it was again, that admission. The house he had shared with his wife must have been filled with noise, television, music, conversation, arguments. Now, there was only silence, a vast, empty space he didn't know how to fill. I like the quiet, I confessed. Or I thought I did. He turned his head to look at me, and I could feel the weight of his gaze even in the darkness. What changed your mind? I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe it's just different when it's forced on you. When all the background noise just stops. It makes you notice how quiet it really is, how alone you really are. I didn't say the last part, but I had a feeling he heard it anyway. He nodded slowly, understanding. He knew exactly what I meant. We were both men who had been left in the quiet, for very different reasons. He was an exile, I was a native. A chill was starting to creep into the air. I shivered, rubbing my arms. Getting cold, Mason said. I've got a fire going inside. In the fireplace. You should. You can come in. If you want. Warm up before you head back, another invitation. Another step across a threshold. My internal alarm bells were screaming at me to go home, to lock my door and retreat to the safety of my own space. But the thought of my cold, dark, empty house was suddenly unbearable. Okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yeah, I'd like that. He led the way inside. His house was sparsely furnished, full of boxes he still hadn't unpacked. It felt temporary, a place where someone was camping out in the ruins of a former life. But in the center of the living room, a fire was blazing in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering glow over everything. It was the heart of the house, a pocket of warmth and life in the midst of transition and disarray. He had 2 camping chairs set up in front of it. He gestured for me to take one. I sat down, holding my hands out to the heat, feeling the warmth seep into my chilled skin. Mason sat in the other chair, poking at the logs with an iron poker, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The only light in the room came from the fire. It painted his face in shifting patterns of orange and red, making his expression even harder to read. We sat in silence again, but this silence was different. It was heavier, more charged. We were inside now, enclosed in the walls of his home, sharing a hearth. The easy camaraderie of the backyard felt a world away. Here, the air was thick with unspoken things. I watched his hands as he tended the fire. They were strong, capable hands. Hands that could build a house or tear out a garden. Hands that had once worn a ring. I found myself wondering what they would feel like. Would they be rough or gentle? I quickly pushed the thought away, a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck. "So, you never said," he started, his voice soft, pulling me from my thoughts. "What you do all day over there?" In the quiet, I told you. "I'm a graphic designer." "No, I mean," he turned to look at me, his blue eyes catching the firelight. "What do you do? Besides work? You're always home. I never see you leave." The observation was so direct, so baldly stated, that I felt my defenses rise. He had been watching me, too. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm a homebody," I said, my voice tight. "There's homebody, and then there's never leaving the house." He countered, not unkindly. "Is everything okay?" The genuine concern in his voice broke through my defensiveness. It had been a long time since anyone had asked me that question. A long time since anyone had noticed me enough to ask. "Yeah," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "I'm fine. Just prefer my own company." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I had the distinct feeling that he could see right through me, right through all the walls and defenses to the lonely man huddled inside. He didn't push, though. He just gave a small nod and turned his attention back to the fire. "I get it," he said quietly. "After everything, I just wanted to be alone. Wanted everyone to just leave me the hell alone." He poked the fire again, more aggressively this time. But it turns out, being alone is loud. In its own way, I knew exactly what he meant. The silence of an empty house could be a roar, echoing with all the things you were trying not to think about. We sat for what felt like hours, just watching the flames, lost in our own thoughts. The fire slowly died down, the big logs turning into glowing, breathing embers. The warmth in the room began to fade, and the chill of the night pressed in against the windows. I knew I should go. I had overstayed my welcome. I was an intruder in his solitude. "It's getting late," I said, my voice sounding rough. "It's cold," he cut in, his voice flat. "Your place is going to be like an icebox." "Mine too." Once this fire dies completely, he stared into the glowing embers, his jaw tight. "You can stay here, if you want." On the couch, the offer hung in the air between us, a fragile, trembling thing. It was a purely practical suggestion, a logical solution to the problem of two cold houses and one dying fire. But it felt like so much more. It felt like a test, a dare. My mind screamed at me to say no, to thank him and walk back across the cold, wet grass to my own bed. But my body was betraying me. It was leaning toward the warmth, toward him. My mouth opened, and the word that came out was not the one I expected. "Okay," he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, as if my answer had been a foregone conclusion. "I'll get you some blankets," he said, rising from his chair. He disappeared into a dark hallway and returned a moment later with a thick pile of bedding. He dropped it on the couch, which was a large, comfortable-looking sectional. "Bathrooms down the hall on the left," he said, his voice all business again. "I'm going to turn in." He hesitated for a second, standing in the middle of the room, a large, uncertain shape in the dying firelight. "Good night, Leo." "Good night, Mason." He walked down the hall and disappeared into a room, closing the door softly behind him. I was alone with the embers and the unfamiliar shapes of his living room. I made a makeshift bed on the couch, the blankets smelling faintly of cedar in him. I lay down, fully clothed, and stared into the darkness. I was in his house. I was going to sleep in his house. The thought was so bizarre, so far outside the realm of my normal life, that I felt a strange, giddy sense of dislocation, as if I were watching a movie about someone else. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind was a hive of activity. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I could hear the house settling around me, the faint sigh of the wind outside. I could hear the distant, muffled sound of him moving around in his room. I could hear the frantic, hopeful, terrified beating of my own heart. It grew colder. The last of the embers in the fireplace winked out, and the room was plunged into a deep, profound blackness. The chill seeped in through the blankets, through my clothes, right into my bones. I curled into a tight ball, shivering, but it was no use. I was freezing. I must have been lying there for an hour, teeth chattering, when I heard a sound. The soft creak of a floorboard in the hall. Then another. Someone was coming. My body went rigid. It was him. It had to be him. His footsteps were slow, hesitant. They stopped just outside the living room. I held my breath, listening. I could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm in the absolute silence. What was he doing? Was he checking on me? Was he going to tell me to leave? Then, he stepped into the room. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, a shift in the air, a solid mass in the darkness. He walked slowly toward the couch, toward me. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. This is it. This is the moment where he realizes what a mistake this was, where he tells me to go. He stopped right beside the couch. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He stood there for a long, agonizing moment. Then, his voice came out of the darkness, a low, rough whisper. "You're freezing." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I couldn't answer. I could only shiver. Another long pause. I could feel him wrestling with a decision. The air was electric with tension. Then, he moved. He didn't go away. He sat down on the edge of the couch, the cushions dipping under his weight. My entire body tensed. He just sat there for a moment, breathing in the dark. Then he spoke again, his voice even quieter, so quiet I could barely hear it. "Move over." The words were not a request. They were a command, a plea, a confession. They hung in the space between us, simple and direct and earth-shatteringly profound. My brain ceased to function. All the overthinking, all the analysis, all the fear, it all just stopped. There was only the cold and his warmth and those two words. I moved. I shifted my body over on the wide couch cushion, making room. It was an automatic, instinctual response, a magnetic pull I was powerless to resist. He lay down behind me, his body a long, solid line of heat. He didn't touch me, not at first. He just lay there, a few inches of cold, empty space between us. But even without touching, I could feel the heat coming off him in waves, a furnace against my icy back. The shivering began to subside. We lay like that for a timeless moment, two separate bodies in the dark, breathing in unison. The silence was absolute, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a terrifying, beautiful intimacy. I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke in his hair, the clean scent of his skin. I was acutely aware of every inch of him, of the rise and fall of his chest, of the sheer, solid fact of his presence beside me. Then, slowly, tentatively, he moved. His arm came around me, settling gently over my waist. His hand, large and warm, came to rest on my stomach. The touch was feather-light, hesitant, as if he were afraid I might bolt. But I didn't. I couldn't. It felt like an anchor, grounding me in the dizzying reality of the moment. He pulled me back against him, closing the space between us. My back was flush against his chest. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. He tucked his head into the space between my neck and shoulder, his breath warm against my skin. It was a gesture of such profound, unguarded intimacy that it made my own heart ache. We fit together as if we were made for it. My body, which had always felt awkward and out of place in the world, suddenly felt right, held, safe. The last of the chill left me, replaced by a deep, pervasive warmth that spread from every point of contact, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection. His hand on my stomach tightened its grip slightly, his fingers lacing through mine. His callous skin was rough against my own. I felt the smooth, naked skin where his ring used to be. The ghost was there, between us, but it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a part of his story, a story that had somehow, inexplicably, led him here. To me, no words were spoken. None were needed. In the cold, silent dark of his broken home, we had found a shared warmth. I closed my eyes, my mind finally, blessedly quiet, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel alone. I felt like I had come home. And against all odds, I slept. The world returned with a hum. A low, electric thrum that vibrated up through the floor, through the couch cushions, into my bones. It was the refrigerator. The power was back. A sliver of pale morning light cut through a gap in the curtains, bisecting the room. The intimate, timeless dark was gone, replaced by the mundane gray of dawn. I was instantly, painfully awake. And I was not alone. Mason was still there, his arms still around me, his body still pressed against mine. In the daylight, the reality of our position was stark and undeniable. I was tangled up with my neighbor on his couch. My neighbor with the sad eyes and the ring tan. My heart started to pound with a slow, heavy dread. This was a mistake. A terrible, mortifying mistake born of cold and darkness and loneliness. In the light of day, it would all fall apart. His breathing was deep and even. He was still asleep. I lay perfectly still, trying not to wake him, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. I needed to slip away, back to my own house, before he woke up and the awkwardness became unbearable. I could pretend it never happened. We could go back to being strangers who exchanged curt nods over a shared property line. Slowly, carefully, I tried to disentangle myself from his grasp. I lifted his hand from mine, inch by inch. His fingers were lax in sleep. I started to slide his arm from around my waist. "Don't." A voice rumbled, low and thick with sleep, right beside my ear. I froze, my entire body rigid with panic. He was awake. He had been awake the whole time. His arm tightened around me, pulling me back against him. It was not a hesitant gesture this time. It was firm, deliberate, possessive. He nuzzled his face against my neck, his morning stubble scratching gently against my skin. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still rough. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my tongue a dry, useless thing. I just lay there, my heart thundering, waiting for the inevitable regret, the awkward apology, the dismissal. He was quiet for a long moment, just holding me, breathing me in. I could feel him slowly coming fully awake. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I slept," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder. "The whole night. I haven't done that in I don't know how long." The simple, honest confession cut through my panic. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a rejection. It was a statement of fact. A gift. He shifted behind me, propping himself up on one elbow. I could feel his eyes on me. I kept my own squeezed shut, unable to face him. Unable to see the regret I was so sure would be there. "Leo," he said softly. "Look at me." I couldn't. I just shook my head slightly, a coward to the last. I felt his calloused fingers touch my cheek, his thumb stroking gently along my jawline. The touch was unbelievably tender. "Please," he whispered. Slowly, reluctantly, I opened my eyes. He was hovering over me, his face just inches from mine. His hair was a mess. His eyes were still soft with sleep, and the lines of exhaustion on his face seemed fainter in the morning light. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't name. It was intense, searching, and completely unguarded. There was no regret in his eyes, only a deep, unnerving sincerity. "Last night," he started, his voice faltering. He took a breath. It wasn't just about being cold. My breath hitched. My carefully constructed defenses, my lifetime of assuming the worst, began to crumble under the weight of his gaze. "Was it?" he asked, his blue eyes holding mine, demanding an answer. Demanding the truth. I finally found my voice, though it was little more than a croak. "No," I whispered. It wasn't just about being cold. A slow smile spread across his face. A real smile this time, not just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. It lit up his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine. His skin was warm. He closed his eyes. "Good," he breathed, a sigh of profound relief. "That's good." We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, just breathing each other in. The hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of the birds outside, the sounds of the world coming back to life, all of it faded away. There was only this quiet, fragile, miraculous connection in the gray light of morning. The awkwardness I had dreaded never came. In its place was a feeling of rightness, of peace, so profound it almost hurt. Eventually, the smell of brewing coffee filled the air. He had set the timer on his machine before the power went out. The mundane domesticity of it was almost comical, a jarring return to normalcy after a night that had been anything but. He pulled away, the loss of contact a sudden ache. "Coffee's ready," he said, his voice still a little rough. He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. I sat up too, feeling self-conscious and exposed in the full light of day. The couch was a mess of tangled blankets, a clear testament to our shared night. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He just looked at me, his gaze soft. "You want some?" "Please," I said. He went into the kitchen, and I could hear him moving around, the clink of mugs, the splash of liquid. I took the moment to try and process what was happening. Mason Cole, my stoic, mysterious neighbor, had spent the night holding me, and now he was making me coffee. It felt like a dream, a wild, impossible fantasy I was afraid I would wake up from at any moment. He came back with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine. This time, the touch felt different. Less like a startling jolt and more like a familiar, comforting warmth. He sat down on the couch next to me, not too close, but not too far away either. A comfortable, respectful distance. We drank our coffee in silence. But it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers or the charged silence of unspoken tension. It was the easy, companionable silence of 2 people who had shared something significant, something that didn't need to be spoken of to be understood. I looked at his hand, wrapped around the warm mug. The ring tan was still there, a pale reminder of a life he had lost. But for the first time, it didn't look like a ghost. It looked like a scar, a mark of a past he had survived, a past that was making way for a future. "So," he said, finally breaking the quiet. "What now?" The question was simple, direct, and terrifying. He was asking me to define this, to put a label on what had happened between us, on what was happening now. "I don't know," I said honestly. My life was a series of carefully planned routines. I didn't know how to navigate this uncharted territory. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I'm new to this," he said, his gaze fixed on his mug. "I mean, not this," he gestured vaguely between us. "But this," he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "Being honest about it. About what I want." My heart skipped a beat. "My marriage," he continued, his voice low. "It was comfortable. Easy. We were good friends who got married because it was what you were supposed to do. But it was never this. It was never real. Not in the way that mattered." He looked down at his hand, at the pale band of skin. "We were both pretending. She was pretending she didn't want more. And I was pretending I didn't want different." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. He was giving me the story of the ring tan. He was trusting me with his truth. "When she left," he said, "it was a relief. And that was the worst part. I felt guilty for being relieved. So I came here, to this empty house, and I just worked. Tried to sweat it out. Tried to punish myself for not being what I was supposed to be." He looked at me, a wry, sad twist to his lips. "And then the power went out." He fell silent, leaving the rest unsaid. He didn't have to say it. I understood. The blackout had stripped away the routines, the distractions, the pretenses. It had left us with nothing but the truth of who we were. 2 lonely men, sitting in the dark, wanting not to be. "I've been watching you," I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "From my kitchen window. Since the day you moved in." He didn't look surprised. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you, too." The mutual admission was a release, a final tearing down of the walls between us. We were no longer just neighbors. We were 2 people who had seen each other, truly seen each other, from across a lawn, and had finally found the courage to cross it. The return to my own house was surreal. I walked across the grass in the bright morning sunlight, the key to my back door feeling alien in my hand. My house was exactly as I had left it, cold and silent and neat. But it felt different. It felt empty. The quiet I had once cherished now seemed to echo with loneliness. I spent the next few days in a fog of anxiety and hope. We didn't talk about what happened. We returned to our routines. His truck rumbled to life at 7 in the morning. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen. We were back in our separate boxes. The fear began to creep back in. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a moment of shared weakness, a strange dream brought on by a thunderstorm? Was he regretting it? Was he going to retreat back into his stoic silence, leaving me with nothing but the memory of warmth in the dark? Every time I saw him in his yard, my stomach would twist into a knot. He would look up and give me a small wave, a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was friendly. It was neighborly. And it was killing me. The easy intimacy of that morning on the couch had vanished, replaced by a polite, excruciating distance. The test was here. The return to the real world, with its sunlight and its rules and its invisible fences between properties. And I was failing it spectacularly, spiraling into a vortex of self-doubt. On the 3rd day, I was standing at my kitchen sink, washing that same damn plate again, watching him wrestle with a lawnmower that refused to start. He yanked the cord again and again, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. Finally, he kicked the machine, a sharp, angry sound that made me flinch. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his hands on his hips, the very picture of defeated masculinity. This was it. My chance. I could let the moment pass. I could turn away from the window and go back to my safe, lonely life. Or I could do something. I could cross the grass. My heart was hammering, but I dried my hands, walked to my back door, and stepped outside. The sunlight was bright, the air warm. He looked up as I approached, his face slick with sweat and grime, his expression wary. Having trouble? I asked, my voice sounding impossibly calm. It's busted, he grunted, kicking the lawnmower again for good measure. You know, I said, my courage faltering for a second before I pushed forward. Sometimes you have to check the spark plug. I had no idea if that was true. I had read it in a magazine once. He stared at me for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. Then, to my utter astonishment, he threw his head back and laughed. A real, deep, booming laugh that echoed across the yard. It was the most wonderful sound I had ever heard. A spark plug, he said, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. You think I didn't check the damn spark plug? He was still chuckling as he walked over to me. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, so close I could smell the sweat and grass and gasoline on his skin. You're ridiculous, he said, his voice soft, the laughter gone, replaced by that same unguarded sincerity I had seen on the couch. I was trying to help, I said, my cheeks burning. I know, he said. He reached out and cupped my face in his dirty, calloused hand. His thumb stroked my cheek, leaving a faint smudge of grease. Thank you. And then he leaned in and he kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was firm and sure and hungry. It tasted of coffee and sunlight and frustration and relief. It was a kiss that said, I've been waiting for this. It was a kiss that said, what took you so long? I melted into it, my hands coming up to grip his strong arms, holding on like I was drowning and he was the shore. He pulled back, resting his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged. I'm sorry, he whispered. For the last few days. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to push you. I thought you regretted it. I confessed, my voice shaky. Regret it. He pulled back enough to look me in the eyes, his expression one of pure disbelief. Leo, it was the first real thing I've felt in a year. How could I ever regret that? The relief that flooded through me was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It was real. This was real. He smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that made my heart ache. Now, he said, taking my hand. Come on. I'll buy you a beer. And then you can watch me actually fix this thing. He led me to his porch, and we sat on the steps, drinking cold beers in the afternoon sun. He went to work on the lawnmower, and I just watched him, a goofy, stupid smile plastered on my face. I watched his strong, capable hands take the machine apart and put it back together. I watched the muscles in his back move under his shirt. I watched the way the sun lit up the pale, naked skin on his finger. And it didn't look like a ghost or a scar anymore. It just looked like a blank space. An empty page, waiting for a new story to be written. Our story. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of quiet, dreamlike wonder. We didn't define what we were. We just were. The invisible fence between our yards dissolved. My back door was always unlocked for him, his for me. We fell into a simple, domestic rhythm. We'd have coffee on his porch in the morning before he left for work. I'd bring him a cold drink when he got home, and we'd sit and talk while the sun went down. We cooked dinners together, sometimes at his place, sometimes at mine. We were building a new kind of quiet, one that wasn't empty, but full of a comfortable, shared presence. He never spent the night on my couch again, and I never spent another night in my own bed. My house became a place I worked, a satellite to the new center of my universe, which was his house. His bed. Us. Lying in the dark, tangled up together, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his childhood on a farm in a state I'd only ever flown over. I told him about my quiet, bookish upbringing, about the parents who loved me but never quite understood me. We were mapping the terrain of each other's lives, filling in the blank spaces. One evening, we were sitting on his porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was one of those perfect, quiet moments. I was leaning against him, his arm draped comfortably around my shoulders, his thumb stroking my arm in a slow, steady rhythm. I was so scared, I said into the quiet. I know, he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. Me too, what were you scared of? I asked, turning my head to look at him. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. That I'd mess it up, he said finally. That I'd finally found something real, and I'd break it. The way I broke everything else. You didn't break anything, I told him, my voice fierce. You survived. And now you're here. He looked down at me, his blue eyes soft in the fading light. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss full of a quiet, profound gratitude. Yeah, he whispered against my lips. I'm here. I looked out at the world from his porch. My own house stood next door, dark and quiet. For 5 years, it had been my sanctuary, my fortress against the world. I had hidden inside it, believing I was safe, when all I had really been was alone. I had spent years watching life through a window, too afraid to step outside and live it. And then a man with sad eyes and a ghost on his finger moved in next door. A man who tore up roses and fixed broken things. A man who knocked on my door in the middle of a storm and showed me that the quiet didn't have to be lonely. He squeezed my shoulder, pulling me closer. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to appear in the twilight sky. It was quiet. A deep, peaceful, perfect quiet. It no longer felt like being buried alive. It felt like home.